burning plastics are going to do me harm. And maybe there's
Private
some
sector,
plastics
obviously.
that he's burning that actually wouldn't do me harm.
Mhm.
The government writes regulations and makes determinations through the EPA, let's say, that it does do harm, and that's the basis of my argument that his burning does harm there. How is
So-
this
So to
world
the extent,
different from what our?
Yeah.
How is that world different? How that's your fantasy world? How is
Sure.
that different from our existing one?
the difference is this, that how much you pay Matt is not an issue of harm. How much
Very
you pay
important
Matt is not an
moment
issue
here.
of harm. That's true. Burning plastic, if it really does harm, in some sense, your world and my world look the same. If there's harm, right? The way to prove harm might be a little different, but at the end of the day, if there's harm, it will look the same. If you beat Matt up, if you whip him, right? You try to enslave him. He brought up slavery before. Then the government would intervene to stop you from doing that, both in your world and in mine, right? But where the difference happens is your choice of whether to pay Matt's health care or not. Now, I don't know if you're required to pay him because maybe you're too small of a business to do so. I don't know how many employees you would need. But at some point, you know that there are hundreds.
Well, I agree. I don't think it should be up to businesses to pay for healthcare. I think it should be paid for through taxes. So yeah.
If not thousands of regulations that dictate how
Agreed.
you and Matt should treat each other that have nothing to do with harm, have nothing
And,
to do with force, have nothing.
Most regulations are like useful in some way or another. It's mostly many of these regulations are more about, you know, again, like workplace health, which again is like just not doing harm, you know, occupational health. Lots of regulations are like tax regulations, like which then obviously you need taxes if you're going to be, if you know, even like someone like him, he recognizes that you need things like police, that you need courts, so obviously you need to pay them through taxes, so obviously you're going to need some sort of tax like code or something. And so like literally then you need antitrust laws as well, like, you know, prevent the formation of monopolies, and of course he's going to favor that too. So I think what you're going to realize is in reality, if you know they actually had to implement a system like they wanted, you would end up with a system pretty close to what you've got now.
To do with coercion,
Yup,
have
taxes
something
would
to do
need
with
to
some
be
kind of
raised as
social
Rubik.
policy. We believe that everybody should have health care.
Yeah, they would need to be raised. Taxes would need to be raised for UBI. I don't care. It's still better.
Therefore, the best way to do it is through employers, and we will force employers to provide that. My government would never do. If you want to pay Matt healthcare, you can.
Yeah,
Little price to pay.
But I agree. There's too much burden on employers to provide a livelihood to employees. And I would eliminate things like any provisions to have to provide healthcare, to provide like maternity leave, anything like that. No, you just got a basic income, and that way that everyone can just be you know, all set, you know, no matter what they do. And that way you relieve that burden from employers. So no provision of healthcare, of pensions, of like paid leave, none of that. Because your basic income is already plenty enough. That's my reasoning.
You guys can negotiate. Maybe he prefers to get cash. Maybe he doesn't want you to pay his healthcare. You would have contractually. You would decide with Matt on that relationship.
Does your government does your government have corporations? In other words, does your government give certain benefits?
So
to
you
corporate-
raised the limited liability issue. So let's deal with the limited liability issue. I mean, limited liability issue for the most part is a contractual issue. It is an issue that relates to the relationship between debt holders and shareholders. Basically, debt holders are saying we're willing to lend you as a corporate entity money in exchange for not be, and we know by doing this, it's in the covenants of the bond, that we can't go after the individual wealth of shareholders. That's a voluntary decision that they made. Now, the government has recognized that, called it a limited liability corporation, but it's recognized a contractual dispute. Now, you cannot lend, you can choose not to lend a corporation money because you think it's too much of a risk and you'd rather be able to actually go after the money of the shareholders. That's all it is. I mean, a big deal is made out of this, but limited liability.
Well, I agree with him on that. I'm pro corporation. I'm pro limited liability corporation. And I'm pro 0% business tax. I think it makes more sense. What matters is fairness between individuals. So where I want to focus everything is on personal income. Like I'll just have a flat personal income tax and no corporate tax. And that way, with your corporate tax, you can just have your own little corporation if you want to do any kind of investing on your own. Just that, just buy a few shares. You do it with your own little corporation. They've done that in Estonia. It seems to be working all right.
Liability basically is just a formalization of a market contract, a voluntary contract.
But Yaron, there may be voluntary, between the debt holder and the shareholder. But in terms of the corporation and the public, the public doesn't volunteer for any of that. I, as an S corp, have certain protections that amongst people I've never even met before.
So what are you protected from? From people
My issue
outside.
with that would be any kind of union, group, association, order, etc.
In what sense would you be why would you have an issue with a union, group, association? I'm sorry, I don't actually understand what you mean. I don't know. Are you? Yeah. If you want me to answer that, I will gladly do so. But you gotta explain more.
If I let's say I infringe upon someone's copyright, I pay that all in pre-tax dollars. If they come after me and they sue me, I am
put aside taxes. Put aside taxes. I'm fine if you want to get rid of the limited liability that corporations have with regard to third parties.
Let's get rid of corporations.
With regard to third parties that do not have a contract with the company, sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's an issue.
I would also.
But the pre-tax stuff, let's put aside because, as I said, corporations don't actually pay taxes.
Well, the problem with this limited liability stuff is that you can get in debt and then you'd have a person be in debt for life and stuff, and that would be detrimental to business, which is why I think having a limited liability corporation actually does kind of make sense to me personally. Just the fact that, yeah, you can't go after the people who own a corporation. I think, like, yeah, I don't know. There's no perfect solution to this because it's kind of unfair to lenders, obviously. It's kind of unfair to
your employees do. But
well, I mean, they're pre-tax in relative to the pass-through.
I mean, I wish everything was pre-tax. I'm not a big fan of taxes, particularly not today.
I don't doubt that. But what of all the advantages that these entities get from society that workers don't necessarily get? Like, for instance, I am, I make my living on the internet largely.
The societies get advantages compared to workers, but not comparable because societies aren't living things, so it doesn't matter if they're advantaged. What matters is fairness between actual living individuals. And so really, if these societies have more advantages, it doesn't matter. What's unfair is when there are certain individuals that manage to benefit from these in an unfair fashion. That's what's unfair. Just the fact they've got corporations and that they've got like tax cuts, that's not a problem because again, they aren't people. That's the thing. Corporations are not people, so it's actually okay to treat them differently.
Established by the government that becomes a commercial vehicle for me. I am a trucking company and I make my money through having high quality infrastructure in a way that I take advantage of that other people either don't have the resources to take advantage of or don't. There are, I mean, just the idea that I have that much more property that needs to be protected by the government is an advantage that I have over these, when I get into a contract theoretically with a worker, et cetera, et cetera.
So a few things. I don't believe government should build
I'm all for
infrastructure.
that. What I'd be scared would be groups of people that would replace corporations in a way and would be the majority in any group or company. How would we war against those?
Groups of people that replace corporations and would be the majority in any group or company, how do we war against those? I'm still not entirely sure. Would groups of people that would replace corporations? Well, the point is then that it would still be corporations. Like, in any case, I'm pro-corporation, like I've said, so, like, maybe you're just saying for what Sam said, just of getting rid of corporations. But yeah, you would in any case end up having something like that. Or I still don't know why you're talking majority in any group or company. That's the problem with workplace democracies. You could, like I've said this, if you got workplace democracy, you could have like 60% of the workers saying that they're going to stop working and still getting paid, and meanwhile the other 40% have to do all the work. That is kind of one of the issues, for instance, of workplace democracy. Um, so I don't know if that is what you were talking about. Um, in any case, getting rid of corporations, then what? You just mean that you get rid of limited liability, which means that you're able to, like, basically uh, ask the owners of the corporation to pay back the debt. Um, I mean, you could do that. I'm not sure it would be really
historically.
beneficial.
In my world, you're asking about my world, right? The trucking company would not be writing off of what you had paid into through it. It would have to pay for its use of infrastructure through tolls or whatever to somebody who built the road, right? Through tolls or whatever. And I think tolling is pretty simple right now. I think
Well, one
all
thing that we've seen is that like the problem is it's hard for private companies to build infrastructure, and we've seen in the United States, well, there's like a very poor train
Aya, that
railway.
reinforced the reason why I switched to your position concerning workplace democracy.
Oh, really? Yeah. So glad to hear it. Um, yeah, this is the problem is that workers fundamentally their interest is much less aligned with the interest of the company and the economy than the shareholders. Like, I mean, the shareholders are more than the workers aligned with the company and the economy because the shareholders basically they benefit when the company benefits, and when the company benefits, the economy benefits. Whereas the workers they benefit when they get money and without having to work. The interest of the worker is at odds with the interest of the company, whereas the interest of the shareholder is much more aligned with the company. Because the interest of the shareholder is to get like a profit and for the value of the company to increase. So it's those two things. It wants the company to grow, and so that obviously means that the company is doing well, and it wants to get like dividends, like from profits and stuff. And but the thing is that there can only be profits if the company is successful. Meanwhile, an employee just wants its salary, and the salary is often the salary does not depend on the profits of the company, which means that the employee doesn't actually care if the company is doing well or not, as long as it's getting a profit. And that would still hold true in a workplace democracy, and so you'd potentially have all sorts of perverse effects through that. And in any case, it would be also very inefficient because like a manager literally it's a full-time job to be a manager to decide what is going to be most successful for the company. If you had to have everyone do that, then you just have everyone spending their whole time being a manager and no other work could be done, and the company would just crash because nobody's doing any other work.
infrastructure could be built and be more efficient and be more productive
And,
on
yeah, and I know there are worker co-ops, so obviously you can do it, but the point is that what you end up doing in a worker co-op is that a few important decisions are made by everyone, but the majority of decisions are still delegated to managers.
a private basis.
And so in practice, it doesn't really change much to be in a worker co-op or not. It kind of ends up being the same thing. So that's why it's not some incredibly earth-changing thing to belong to a worker co-op versus a traditional company. It's kind of the same.
Let me just say something about the internet. I mean, this mythology that the government built the internet is truly nuts. And while it's true that government funded university programs and academics and so on that ultimately
that's another thing.
created
No, research. The government funds a bunch of bunch of fundamental research, which again doesn't have enough short-term economic interest to be worthwhile. And so lots of sort of really fundamental advances in science are enabled through funding by the government. Again, this is where he really misunderstands. That is a fundamental. I don't support government funding of college actually, because I don't think that's really all that useful and I don't think it's really fair to people who don't go to college. And I think lots of college degrees aren't really necessary, not very useful. They don't really make people much more useful for society. So I don't support free college, but I do support the funding of both basic education up to high school, let's say, and I support the funding of fundamental scientific research
basis on which
by taxes.
the internet was built.
And yeah, infrastructure. Look, the United States has a terrible train infrastructure. China now, despite having GDP per capita only 1/6 of the United States, approximately.
Absolutely. Up to high school I support as well, and scientific research and infrastructure.
Yeah, well, glad to hear it. China has now a way better railway system than the United States. Just saying, okay? Because it actually invested in public railway infrastructure development. If you don't have public development for infrastructure, you won't get good infrastructure. We're seeing this in the United States with the railways.
Sure, but if the government is going to fund something like university research,
And one of the reasons for that is because you need like expropriation and stuff. So even if you had a private company do it, it would still need to be through like a bunch of government approval and the government being able to like expropriate a bunch of people so that you can make way for the new tracks, you know. And so like, and not expropriate, like pay, you know, like you'd still pay them off, whatever. But the point is that it needs a ton of government approval, so it'd still be a largely state sort of partnered enterprise to build more infrastructure.
funds a
If
lot of
only the
university
government would
research,
try to learn
90%
from
of
other government policies and ideologies XD.
Yeah, but yeah, to some extent they do. But I think it's not the government; it's just that they're people that like him that sort of stick to their own ideologies that aren't really beneficial, and it's just kind of absurd. Government is useful. I mean, most of the things that government is currently doing, they are good things, and getting rid of them would not be a good thing.
it is garbage, and you never see. Once in a while, you see something that
Oh yeah,
produces a
garbage. How about garbage collection? Okay, so you could have private garbage collection companies, sure. But then you'd have like multiple, and then you'd have like, how would you do it, you know? You'd like some people, you know, would have the garbage picked, but not others because they didn't sign up for the garbage, you know, they didn't sign up to it, and then you'd have just garbage rotting on the street because, look, I don't know. I mean, you could do it, but it's also again seems a bit weird. Like I think garbage collection is another thing where I think this having the state do it is pretty useful, and having a private company would make it much more difficult because how could it charge? How could it charge people? Precisely, people don't want to pay for it, and if you had to make them pay for it, they would just dump it, you know. And so, like literally, the
Garbage
only
subscriptions, yeah, imagine, haha.
yeah. Again, garbage collection is, since you mentioned the word garbage, that's a great example of where the government is useful. By and large, where we've got the government doing stuff is because it's better that way.
result. And then we saw the government did it. The government did very little of it. They funded randomly a bunch of research, and some of it turned out to be good. Now, the idea that
Yeah, a bunch of random research. Yeah, that is fundamental research. That is how like science and knowledge and civilization progresses, is through that fundamental research that is funded by the government, and that wouldn't happen if it wasn't funded by the government, because people then would just, all these scientists would just have to do a job that produces money in the short term. And what it doesn't realize is that actually this is like you know how there's taxation on negative externalities like carbon. You know, you tax it because there's a societal cost in the long term of emitting carbon. Well, this is like a positive externality. Fundamental science is a positive externality. In the short term, it doesn't make you any money, but in the long term, there's a tremendous amount of technology that could be born from this science. And so in that sense, you could just say that subsidizing science is really just a negative taxation, or like a taxation of positive externalities. So you're paying for them for the positive externalities.
research wouldn't happen if not for the government is bizarre. Research was
It's not
happening well
bizarre.
before government started funding it.
Yeah, but there's a
But
lot
it's
less.
true that once the government starts funding something, it crowds out
Where's his accent? I can't tell what his accent is because he's called Yaron, so maybe that's Israeli, but it doesn't sound like an Israeli accent to me at all. I wonder
everybody
what his
else.
accent is.
That is, you don't expect private funding of university research if the government is going to do it. You know, some of the biggest innovations in all of human history happened at a time when government was funding exactly zero research. And that was during the 19th century.
Yeah, but it's because there's a few people who had enough money to do that. And because at the time, it was a lot easier to make breakthroughs because there's just a lot less knowledge. And like, I don't know, it was like low-lying fruit. It was much easier to just be like your sort of person on your own doing your little autodidactic experiments and stuff. Nowadays, you know, we progress a lot more. We need a lot more people to keep on progressing. That is a flawed argument.
In England, in the United States, where there was no government funding of any research.
Again, back in the day, you could just tinker around in your own home with just crude materials, and you could literally make breakthroughs just by doing that. Now that is no longer possible. The low-lying fruit has been picked, and you need government funding to to actually make significant advances.
We got electricity, and we got the steam engine.
Where did that
and
wealth come from,
airplanes, and so on. Matt, I'm sorry, I missed
Where
that.
did that wealth come from? That
it came from people producing and creating and building,
and a little bit of like the triangle slave trade and all of that.
But the slave trade is wealth destroying.
I mean, it created wealth.
No, the wealth trade is wealth destroying. Let's be very clear about this. The South was poor, the North was rich. It's one of the reasons the North won. Slavery
hold on for one second.
Slavery from an economic perspective you keep raising slavery, so I need to answer this question. Slavery is first of all immoral and evil and so on, but it is a net economically destructive force. It is not a productive force. There would have been a lot more wealth created without slavery, and indeed much more wealth was created post-slavery than there was pre-slavery. So I know
that's true, because there's more again, not being a slave, you got in a way, well, as a slave, you just got, your entire incentive is like the stick. It's like they're going to kill you if you're not a slave. Without slavery, you've got more of a carrot. So you've got this incentive of earning money in it. So certainly nicer, and presumably can also be more productive.
I know the easiest thing to do when the 19th century is raised is to say, but it's all slavery. But that's just an economic and historical fallacy.
I don't want to get, I want to stay on where we were.
So let me finish my point about the internet. So because Matt interrupted me, the point is that the internet, yes, some infrastructure with regard to the internet was produced by government. That would have happened even without the government. That is this.
My guess, it wouldn't have happened as fast.
Plenty of capital flowing into research throughout the last.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there is capital. That is true. That is true. But there is more with the government.
Centuries without government flowing into it. So yes, so you would have to. You're using a private service. I assume YouTube is making a lot of money off of your show.
All right,
good for them.
Yaron,
again, bring up the issue of externalities. Like, companies aren't able to properly make the amount of money that they should for research, just like companies don't have to pay the amount of money that they should for emitting carbon.
Let me just address some of those. First of all, in terms of the slavery, I have interviewed at least a half a dozen authors who have written extensively that the northern wealth was just as tied into the free labor and created the entire cotton industry, and it had knock-on effects throughout the world, including in Britain, because you had zero input in terms of labor, and cotton at that time was incredibly labor intensive to produce. And when you have the ability to produce that labor for nothing, virtually nothing, it has knock-on effects. But
can I just say one thing about that, and then I'll let you. Slavery has existed from forever. We've had slavery.
How about the triangle slave trade?
All right, Matt, please.
Slavery has existed.
Matt, please.
Slavery has existed forever. The fact is that something different happened in the 19th century, and it wasn't some innovation with regard to slavery. It was the discovery and the use of capitalism. And the fact that slave labor was mitigated. If you look at the actual wealth created during the 19th century, almost none of it was created as a consequence of slavery. And I know there's a massive political agenda of painting the 19th century in that way, but it is distortive and it is wrong. And if you look at the places in the world without slavery that has taken the same principles as capitalism developed in the 19th century in the United States, they developed wealth as fast, if not faster, than the United States. So the slavery issue is just a massive perversion and distortion, and it's sad to see that is the critique of a period that was.
Listen, we're gonna let's just table this because I've literally interviewed a half a dozen people on this. I know, and experts at this who disagree.
Experts at a political angle on it. Okay, absolutely.
Okay,
I'm sure you haven't interviewed the experts that would mitigate that. That would say the opposite.
I have actually talked to many libertarians before who've made a similar argument, but without the data. But nevertheless, let's go back to just even your description of the internet. Now, your argument is a counterfactual that's impossible for any of us to argue, which is the internet would have existed even if the government hadn't spent all this money on research, which by the very expense of it is indicative of it is research that they're going out there and they're laying a lot of bets on stuff that doesn't necessarily pay off, which of course capital is highly reluctant to do. We see it in the context of the COVID, right? Like you would not have had, without the billions of dollars that were pumped into these private entities, without the guarantee of distribution, even if this stuff doesn't work, you wouldn't have seen the COVID vaccines developed at the same rate, and you wouldn't have seen so many of them.
Sam, none of that is true. I mean, I encourage people to look at the critiques of the entrepreneur state. I mean, you're referring to a book called The Entrepreneur State, where she lays out the case of, well, maybe you're not, but the case that the internet was funded by government. I encourage people to look at the critiques of the entrepreneur state and look at exactly what was funded, what was not funded, and what would have happened if free market, if those elements of that are still free in our markets hadn't stepped in and turned the internet into what we know of it today. I don't believe that's true of COVID either. The fact is that the only reason we have a vaccine today is the two companies were set up completely in the marketplace, not funded by government, Moderna and BioNTech in Germany, set up trying to do mRNA, trying to create mRNA technologies for all kinds of, and they were ready. They were ready.
Moderna was heavily funded by the NIH prior to this.
No, it wasn't funded by the NIH. Again, research on which Moderna later was funded by the NIH. Sure. Again, if the government is funding all research, you're not going to be able to find a company.
It's not funding all research. It's funding the research that is the longest shots. I mean,
no, that's not true.
Yaron,
it's exactly the opposite. So I'll give you one example. I'll give you an example of exactly what you're saying. When COVID was, when we discovered there was COVID out there were many researchers and scientists out there who wanted to jump in and try to get funds to do research and to develop drugs relating to COVID. You know, in March of last year.
Like COVID, you can still things like that. Yeah, you can still have quite a lot of advances, but but there's fundamental research. Lots of people right now are researching stuff that has no obvious practical application for now, and it's only far in the future that you would have actually some economic benefits that could be derived from them. And again, no company is going to be willing to do that kind of research.
And yet they couldn't, because the government bureaucracy was such that they couldn't get the grants, the grant authority wasn't there, they couldn't switch the authority from what they were doing to something else. The people who jumped in with the private sector, now it's true that the government stepped in and said, we'll buy everything that you produce. As if in a free market that couldn't have happened, right? As if in a free market, insurance companies don't have an incentive to do exactly that. I know you'll pull a face, but we could lay down a scenario where profit-seeking, profit-maximizing evil corporations actually seek to buy as many vaccines as they can because it's cheaper than actually paying for treatment in hospital, which is what would have happened in a free market. But look, we can argue about the factual and the counterfactual. To me, the deeper issue about free markets is not, can we draw these scenarios? Because I think, you know, if you gave me enough time, I could draw you the exact scenario of what would happen under COVID and a free market, and a lot fewer people die than under the 600,000 that died in the world in which we have the government involved in it. The government was an obstacle at every step of the way. It didn't do its job. It didn't test, screen and isolate, which is its job. It wouldn't let private enterprise produce tests until it was way too late. The CDC insisted on making the test themselves, and it was a lousy test. And the vaccine distribution is a joke, centrally planned, was a complete abomination, could have been much more efficient if it was done in the free market. We could go over all of these in great detail. And
I'm not sure, because again, the problem is that lots of people are so poor that they probably couldn't afford the vaccine. So in this case, this is why for healthcare in general, I don't think, usually I advocate for free market policies, but not when it comes to healthcare, because often what people need is more expensive than what they can afford.
Present a counterfactual, and you'll say it's counterfactual, so who cares? But the essential is this. I don't believe that the government telling you what research to do. I don't believe the government building infrastructure. I don't believe the government getting involved in our lives is moral or right or just. The only government is for...
Yeah, that's weird when these sort of market worshippers actually go as far as to say that somehow like immoral to have the government interfere. That's where it's kind of
Government is coercion.
I
The
get a bit
only
lost.
time coercion and force is
Government is
justified
coercion.
is in self-defense. And it has no business, the government has no business, the majority has no business in telling me what values to pursue, what education to get, what research to do. That are choices that need to be left to
I guess
individuals.
it kind of fails to take into account the fact that individuals might actually want to have a government that does these things, you know, and like if people want it because they recognize that they'll be better off with it because they'll be wealthier overall, then the government does have a business in doing that. You know, if to ensure prosperity and fairness between individuals, you need the government to interfere, then it is justified. Like freedom, like just freedom from direct coercion is not like the only ethical value. This is the problem of these sort of, you know, market worshippers, is that they think that the only ethical value really is to just be prevented from actual physical active coercion, and not even like they don't even care about freedom, like because to have freedom you need to have money, because if you don't have money you don't have choices to do like lots of things. But so in a sort of completely quote free market, absent of any direct coercion, you'll still lack freedom from not having money. And this is why I don't call them libertarians. They call themselves libertarians. I call them market worshippers, because they don't care about maximizing people's freedom. All they care about is just implementing this very sort of rigid principle here, which is not fundamentally about freedom. So they're not libertarians. The U.S. libertarians, that sort of the thing that passes for a libertarian in the U.S. is not libertarianism. It's just again, it's market worshippers
and not to central planners.
All right, Yaron, let me. I'll get to the morality of this because you know we may have a.
Okay, I'm gonna stop this.